Titles may change a little bit. I think the presenters are pretty locked in, but at least you'll have the dates. All right, so our next meeting is in October 15th. Roger Wilbur, who's here today, is going to talk about the evolution of businesses in the town of Coeymans. On Sunday, November 12th, Karen Hess, those of you who have been with us a long time may remember Karen, did a talk a number of years ago in Arianche, Coeymans, and she's coming back to do a talk on Baron Coeymans, titled Baron the Miller, He Pays No Rent, and Who Was This Founding Father of Coeymans? So that should be an interesting, and that's kind of going to be our last presentation related to our 350th anniversary of Coeymans. Not that we're not going to do Coeymans relating talks in the future, but you know, all of this year was pretty much focused on the history of Coeymans. Then December 10th, Sunday, December 10th is our annual open house, holiday open house. Sunday, January 14th, Jonathan Palmer will be here to talk about the history of the hay press. He just did a talk down in Greene County, and he's going to be coming here to do a similar talk. On Sunday, February 11th, Reverend Antonio and Reverend Dr. Roxanne Booth are going to talk about the Great Migration, especially how it relates to Coeymans. March 10th, we're going to have a talk on the history of the USS Slater. And then Sunday, April 14th, a talk potentially on funeral iconology by Kelly Grimaldi. Kelly was here a number of years ago and gave a talk on the cemeteries in Albany. So we're looking forward to that. Couple things that's been happening here. We had the election of our two trustees for the year. Kathy Ricciardi and Rose Carmen were both re-elected for 3-year terms. And then at our trustee meeting in September, we had the election of officers. No changes. I'm still president, Roger Wilbur vice president, Kathy Ricciardi secretary, and Marie Sturgis treasurer. So everything has pretty much stayed the same. And we certainly thank everybody for all their hard work. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about today's program, Jacob Parish Who. So we welcome one of our trustees, John Bonafide, who will speak to us about Jacob Parish. John's talk will focus on the Parish family and that once prominent cemetery that they established. As many of you know, John's a local historian and preservationist. He recently retired from the New York State Division of Historic Preservation, where he served more than 3 decades as the program director and architectural historian. He wrote more than 500 nomination documents, including many here in our community, including the Coeymans Landing project. So we now have the Coeymans Landing Historic District, thanks to John's hard work. He's also worked with multiple government agencies, developing and implementing state and federal historic preservation. John also teaches part-time at the SUNY Albany, and he's been a trustee with us since 2013. So please join in welcoming John as he enlightens us on this mysterious. Before I do that, 2 more things I forgot to tell you. On Saturday, September 30th, there's 2 events going on related to the Coeymans 350th. There's a golf tournament. If you're a golfer and interested in playing, you can sign up through Sycamore Country Club. And that same day, that whole afternoon is related to a family harvest festival. There's a bulletin board in the back with information on it. There's all kinds of family-related events for that. So if you're interested, please check that out on your way out.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Tom.
I'm supposed to turn the mic on and it sounds like it's on, so that's good. Well, thank you all. I was told I was speaking, we decided I would speak in September because no one ever comes. So they figured, why waste a good speaker when there's no one here? So thank you all. I know it's a really busy Sunday for a lot of reasons, and I'm going to jump into this because it's one of those talks that is going to ramble in a lot of different directions. It's going to follow a year-by-year kind of progression, but it's going to go off in some different tangents. And I think that's like most good history should. And for those of you who knew Mary Farinelli, how many of you remember Mary? Mary would have loved this topic. Because you know, Mary was a bulldog. She'd find a piece of history and just keep digging into it until she got every bone or toy the dog buried. And this is kind of what happened with this. I started looking at Jacob Parish probably in 1991 when the town did its bicentennial. And at that point, owned the store on Main Street. I can't think of her name now.
Ronnie Ford.
Ronnie had the maps of the hamlet, the old bird's eye view printed, and she hand numbered all the different places. And I'd never seen it before. I'd never had a copy. The internet wasn't that big back then. It was not. So I got that and really got into looking at different bits and pieces of that map. And that kind of started me on the path for this particular talk and the research I've been doing on and off for probably 30 years now. But really kind of the last 6 years, things really took off. And I need to thank Greene County Historical Society and Kless and Jean Bush, who, when I asked them several years ago if Greene County had anything on Jacob Parish, they sent me a really nice printout that they put together of a number of deeds and a lot of Greene County census data that really helped feed into this project. So, you know, thank you and kudos to Greene County and Kless and Jean. The other thing is, for those of you, I'm a child of the 70s, that was my era for high school, and Styx was big back then. And when I heard this song back in the late 70s and early 80s, I thought, someday I'll be able to use this line from that song, because it's a perfect analogy for history. And it's nothing ever goes as planned, even pharaohs turn to sand like a drop in the ocean. So even though we plan for the best, eventually it's going to go away. So hopefully today, this will in some way reinvigorate Jacob Parish. If you speak their name, they never die. So we're going to speak a lot of parishes' names today, and people they're associated with, and kind of go through their family history. And hopefully when we get done, you'll have a greater appreciation of a family who none of you have probably ever heard of. We've heard of Coeymanses and Tennites and Vanderzees and, you know, Hotelings and on and on. How many people have ever heard of the Parish family? Very few. So let's just dive into this and see how it goes. There we go. So again, when I first looked at the Coeymans map, what struck me, besides the fact I was working on the Civic Center at that point, was this lone cemetery sitting on a hillside at one corner of the map. And if you look at the original, you can see it just sitting lonely on top of the hillside over here. Why is it there? You know, why did they record this cemetery? It seems like a really odd thing when you're recording buildings. Why would you pick up this cemetery? So that kind of really led me to think, okay, whose cemetery is it? Why is it important? You know, what made the engraver pick this out of the landscape? And again, just a kind of a closer view of that. With great care, they placed it on top of this hillside in the view shed. So if you try to locate the cemetery today, for those of you who know where Youthy Boulevard is, right off of Church Street, you go up the hill. If you get out of your car and walk through the weeds and up the hill and over, you're going to come across the cemetery sitting in the woods. It's pretty far in. You can't really get to it until fall or winter. It's pretty overgrown to get into it most of the time. And just as an aside, one of the really cool tools we get to use today that we didn't have in 1991 or probably up until about 10 years ago available to historians is LiDAR. You know, if you've ever watched the History Channel, you've watched where, you know, they go down into the Inca jungle and they'll strip away all the landscape, you know, all the vegetation, and see what actually is on the ground. We have that capability right now online. It's very easy to go to New York GIS Clearinghouse, and there's a LiDAR system that you can zoom in on. So when you strip away all those trees we just saw, this is what it looks like. And if you look in that circle, you'll see this rectangular shape. Obviously not a natural shape. That's the parish cemetery. So sitting on the crest of the hill, you can actually see the shape of the hill, and that really does rise to the top of the hill. So very carefully placed, very much like what's shown in the 1889 Burley litho, but not quite a big square cemetery. It's kind of elongated in reality. So we'll talk about that too as we get a little farther into this. So who is Jacob? Jacob Parish was born in 1762. He was born in Oyster Bay, Long Island. His father was Townsend, Jacob went by Townsend Parish. Townsend, born 1732. Townsend was a Quaker preacher, very famous Quaker preacher on Long Island. Long Island had a very strong Quaker population, and Townsend was well known for his traveling throughout various Quaker settlements there and preaching. Townsend's father was a man named Dr. Matthew Parish. Matthew Parish was a British naval surgeon who had come to Long Island in the mid-18th century with, the British because they had ownership of New York at that point, in the colonies. He came in and was stationed off of Long Island for a while and liked what he saw there. And he would eventually settle there. Jacob's mother, Zeruah Townsend, came from kind of a different background. Her family were farmers. They were relatively prosperous, but not very few farmers were. Her father used to take goods and crops on a barge, and he would transport them, along the shore to get them to various locations for sale. And at one point, he dies in an accident, probably on one of those voyages, and is left, the family, Zeruah and her brother and her mother, kind of left to run the family business. And in one of the descriptions, when the father died, Mom, Esther Smith Townsend, is described in the family history as a short, stout figure. And she took over the shipping business. And as part of that business, she began trading goods between Long Island and the Carolinas. And on one of those trips, Dr. Parish happened to be a passenger aboard the sloop traveling south, where he met the young Zeruah, and they fell in love and got married, and the rest is Parish family history. So, what ends up happening is Jacob Parish is born 1762, lives in Long Island. He in turn meets Freelove Dodge, another Quaker, and Freelove is not what children of the 60s think of. In Quaker terms, the name really refers to God's free love for all his beings. So free love has that connotation. There's a number of Freeloves in this family from different sides. It's kind of interesting, they're all Quakers. So his mother is Freelove Dodge, 1741 to 1825. The Townsends have a fairly palatial house in Oyster Bay. This is actually a 1900 bird's eye view, but the parish house is circled on the map. This was demolished in the 1930s for the local high school, but it was captured at least at that point. Freelove Weeks Powell, who is Jacob's wife, was born in 1764. She's born in Hempstead, so very close to Oyster Bay, obviously a way they would have met each other. Her father is Henry Powell, who is also relatively prosperous person on Long Island. He also transports goods by using the Sound. Another story of an accident where her father and her brother were transporting goods. According to the family genealogy, the son, 13 years old, was on the vessel as the father was on horse. I don't know how you drag them down the coast of Long Island, but apparently that's the story. The boat capsizes, the father, seeing the son struggling, goes into the water, and they both drown. So unlike Zeruah, this family is more destitute as a result of that. Mom doesn't carry on the business. Her sons actually take over for the family, and her sons are Jacob, James, and Thomas Powell. And what happens with them is they eventually will take over the father's business, or at least try to. And that will eventually lead to them relocating to Orange County. So the family moves to Orange County to find a better life. They then leave Orange County, move to Marlborough, Ulster County, where the older boys establish a lime kiln and a store. The family at least does enough to survive. The mother dies. There's no known date for her death, but it's believed to be before 1790. The brothers eventually will move to New York City in 1798, and Freelove Powell and Jacob Powell will marry. We'll see that in a minute. So Jacob, who has, Thomas Powell, who returns from New York City to Newburgh around 1799, comes back with his brother because of an outbreak of yellow fever very shortly after going to the city to start a new business. They relocate to Newburgh because Newburgh at that point is really becoming an important stopping point on traffic of goods making its way up into the Erie Canal. So, or at least shipping on the Hudson, and eventually become an important port when the Erie Canal opens. They started an important shipping business, or at least a business that helps them to sustain a fairly good living. And eventually they will open a number of businesses, and one of the important businesses is the steamship line. That line will also include, will grow after Jacob Powell dies in 1823. Thomas launches a steamship line, and the first of his steamers is the Highlander. The second will be the Thomas Powell in 1846. Thomas marries Mary Ludlow. She's also born in Hempstead, also from a Quaker family. For those of you who know Hudson steamer history, the Mary Powell, which was a pretty iconic vessel on the Hudson, served for 57 seasons, beginning in 1861, ending in 1917. The ship could carry up to 1,800 guests, which is a pretty massive ship. So the Powells are a very prosperous family that plays into this, and Jacob's wife, Freelove, is a member of that family. And Thomas's history will play very strongly into Jacob and the family in Coeymans as well. So Jacob and Freelove marry at Hempstead or Oyster Bay around 1787. And what I want to impress upon you all at this point is, in Coeymans history, we have one portrait of an early member of the community. Who is it? Mariachi. These portraits date from about the first years of the 1800s. So while we have a big gap during the 1720s to 1800, to have images of very early residents of the town, actual portraits where we get a good sense of what they looked like, I think is pretty rare, which is another interesting component to this family's history. That's going to get expanded upon as we move a little farther into this. Once they marry, Jacob and Freelove moved to Newburgh. And I think their move to Newburgh is pretty contemporaneous with the whole family's relocation in 1788 to Orange County. So I think it's all part of the family just moving off of Long Island and moving up the Hudson Valley. Their first child, Henry, is born in 1788. There's some question. Greene County has records that show him being born at Coxsackie, but in a lawsuit that actually goes into a lot of detail about the family, Henry is shown as being born actually in Newburgh. They'll have several children. Henry's the oldest, followed by Mary, Nancy, James. We'll talk about James a little later. Elizabeth, Daniel, who we'll talk about. Thomas, we'll talk about. Benjamin and Martha. So a fairly big family, and most of them do live to adulthood, except for Thomas. The other interesting thing about Jacob Parish is that in doing the research, I found that there was a journal of his down at the New York Historical Society, which struck me as interesting that they had one of his business journals. I was able to photograph the journal and kind of go through it. It's really interesting. It covers his business years from 1793 to 1823, so it's a 30-year span of business. But it's not, some years there's a lot, other years there's one entry. And what's really interesting about this journal is I expected it was going to be a journal of Jacob's business. So Jacob is keeping track of his business activity. It's not. It's his receipt book. So what would happen is Jacob would incur a debt, and then when he paid his debt, his debtor would sign the book and say what was paid for. The book has, 60 pages in it or so, and a couple of hundred entries. None of them are by Jacob's hand. They're all signed by others. So what it is, it's a really interesting kind of signature book of people living in Coeymans, people living in New York, people living in Coxsackie and Catskill, all of whom are doing business with Jacob, and then giving him a receipt in his book. So the first entry in the book is dated 1793, and is Jacob doing business in New York City, which kind of doesn't surprise me. I think what was happening is Jacob was probably doing business with his uncle, or at least his uncle-in-law. So Thomas Powell probably had Jacob at least set him up in business and was in some way involved, because Thomas had a very successful shipping business from New York and all the way down into the Carolinas. So there's kind of no reason to believe that Jacob didn't avail himself of that opportunity. So 1793, Jacob's doing some business in New York City, and you can see that these are the sign-offs from whoever he was doing business with in the city. By July of 1793, there's very few entries anymore of New York City. They're all in Coxsackie. So now we pretty much know Jacob has now left Newburgh, New York, Newburgh, and is now settled in Coxsackie with his family. So this is the earliest date we know. He may have been there a few years earlier than this, but we know by 1793 he was residing in Coxsackie, and we'll see some of that because this particular notation has two different signatures, from one Abraham Van Bergen and one Henry Van Bergen. One is for what I believe is a house that he was renting, because it talks about payment to the 1st of May next. And the next one is for a garden lot. The garden lot would be, where you would farm and pasture your horses or do whatever you're going to do. So it's always important to have land and a home. And Jacob always rented, at least according to his book, when he was in Coxsackie. And there's a number of entries from the Van Bergens. So I think this rental is going on for a number of years. So we kind of tracked him down from Oyster Bay up to Coxsackie. Interesting entry is a news clipping, a notice here that was in the Albany Gazette. And it's a meeting of the inhabitants of Coxsackie, the landing. And Jacob is chairing this meeting where they're renaming the Coxsackie landing to Belfast. I've never heard that. It was pretty short-lived, but they would proceed to choose a committee for the purpose, and they're naming it based on kind of the people there. So it gives you some sense of, okay, obviously Coxsackie, there had to be a fairly substantial population of Irish at that point. But very interesting to see Jacob at that point had risen high enough from his arrival in the early 1790s to chair this committee at the landing of the inhabitants to rename the community. And here you see the first entry in Jacob's book, a bill from Samuel Hume, dated August 1795, location Belfast. When I first saw this and going through the journal, I'm thinking, holy cow, he made it to Belfast? No, he made it to Coxsackie. So again, following up, just tracking Jacob and his travels, this is the 1799 property tax census of Coxsackie, and here you can see that Jacob Parish and his evaluation, as well as his brother, Penn Parish. They're both living in Coxsackie, and the tax rolls have Jacob in Coxsackie up until 1803, and that's the last tax roll he shows up on. Penn Parish would move to Coxsackie and would live out the rest of his life in Coxsackie. He's enumerated there in 1820 and dies, I think, around in the 1840s. And then it kind of goes bad. So, and what I found in dealing with the history of Coeymans especially, everybody had property sold at tax auction by the sheriff. It seems to have been a very, I think you think about bouncing a check and how horrified you are. So many of these people end up with these ads in the newspaper where the sheriff is selling their land or selling off their mortgages or selling off their debt or selling off whatever they had to pay their debt. This is Jacob Parish in 1804, along with Jane Litchfield. It was Litchfield's property that was sold. Jacob obviously had some business deal with him. Litchfield lived 3 miles west of the river in Coeymans, so his land is being sold, and it's It's being sold at the inn occupied by Mr. Stansbury, who I don't know, I've never heard of out there, but published on February 6th of 1804, and it's a writ of feri facias, which is cause to be sold. So you don't pay your debts, the sheriff comes in, takes your property, sells it, pays off the debt, you might get the residual. So 1804, Jacob is now kind of crossing the border from Greene County into Albany County, and the first time we see him in Albany County is with a tax sale. 1805, he still appears to be paying rent in Coxsackie, so he's thus received of Jacob Parish $14.50 in full for house rent. That'll be due the 1st of May next, John Spoor. Spoor lives in Coxsackie as well. This will be the last entry for Coxsackie, because a little later that year, in December, we see the first reference to Coeymans. So Jacob has now left Coxsackie, has moved to Coeymans, and you can see a very similar kind of notice here in his account book. And again, from this day forward, there's very few business transactions anywhere other than Coeymans. So here we see he's received, this is 11 pounds and 10 shillings. And it's interesting too, there's dollars and shillings still being used, and pounds. And so you're kind of going back and forth in this period at the turn of the century. But he's very clearly showing up in Coeymans at this point. And by 1810, he's enumerated in the first census for Coeymans during that period. Several of his children are living with him, but several seem to not be. And they're his oldest children. They're Henry, I believe it's Henry at this point, who's 22. He's out of the house, or close to 22. Daniel, who is 16, and Thomas, who's 14. I believe they're probably all apprenticing with Thomas Powell down in Newburgh, which makes sense at those ages. So the rest of the family is in Coeymans, and by this time, 2 of their daughters had died. Elizabeth and Mary both passed away, or Elizabeth had passed away in 1809 at the age of 15. As far as I can tell, she is the first person that there was a stone that's captured at the parish cemetery. But what's interesting is we're going to learn it's not really the parish cemetery at this point. Jacob also is very litigious, which is interesting. That seems to be a Dutch thing, but the Quakers must have had a good sense for it too. Within 1 year, in Judge John McCarty's journal, where he kept a record of all his court cases in Coeymans, Jacob logs 12 lawsuits for debt owed to him, and wins them all. But John McCarty's judge logbook captures all of those events, all those suits and the outcomes. 1813, to give you a sense of the setting, Jacob is living in Coeymans. He's suing people in Coeymans. There's things happening in Coeymans. But Coeymans Landing is still a very tiny place. Horatio Gates Spafford, his Gazetteer of New York State is kind of a historian's little gem, because it has these great little vignettes and descriptions of all the communities in New York State. And Coeymans is, there's a landing with wharves and several sloops at the mouth of the Coeymans Creek. Where is Coeymans Village, of about 30 houses, the post office, 2 grain mills of 5 running stones, and a sawmill. So a nice little compact, you kind of get a vision of this little bustling, maybe not bustling, but waterfront activity going on in 1813, and by then Jacob's there. Well, where is Jacob? Well, what's interesting is, thanks to his journal, and this seems to be an interesting little nugget I think that's been overlooked, is I'm 99.9% sure he's renting the Coeymans Castle, because it's noted that he's living in the stone house at Coeymans, and later on we'll see that it's actually called the Old Stone Castle. Now we know he's not in the Ariange Coeymans house, and we know he's not in the Bron Coeymans house, because they're not called Coeymans Castle. So Coeymans Castle really is got to be Baron and Peter Coeymans' house at the landing, which at this point is owned by deed by John Johnson. So the combination of Stonehouse and Johnson's ownership kind of nails it down that he's paying rent for the Coeymans Castle. Joslin had acquired the property, or John Johnson, 1813, he owns it. Parish is paying rent to him when he dies. The rent in the book goes to Widow Johnson, or the estate of John Johnson. And then following the deeds from the Johnson family, it shows that they sold the estate to Richard and James Lawton. It then went to Henry Joslin, and then it went to Josiah Sherman, who would build the Tobin House, which we know down at the waterfront now. Joslin had acquired the property in 1853 when the Lawtons defaulted on the property. So in Joslin's deed, when it was sold to Josiah Sherman, which is dated April 1855, he states that the property was formerly occupied by Joslin as a homestead, which is kind of an interesting little piece of history. When you say something's being occupied as a homestead, it means somebody's living there, and it kind of would point to Joslin living there at some point. But this is 1855. All the histories we know of, the castle's torn down in the 1830s. So we have a 20-year gap we've got to try to figure out. The deed also states that there's a red storehouse, which is exempted from the sale, and refers to the homestead itself, and this is in quotes from the deed, that said building and foundation stone hereto, which said building and stone are to be removed from said lot before the first day of April 1856. So what are the foundation stones and what are the stones being removed in 1856 if the Coeymans Castle was demolished, according to the popular histories, in 1832 or 1833? So just a nice nugget to ponder. When the Lawtons default and the debt notice is published in 1853, a few years before that deed I just read to you, it talks about the property and defines it beginning at the northeast corner of the old stone house, or where it formerly stood, formerly owned by Peter Coeymans. So within a couple of years, we have two different, it's gone, it's not gone, what's going on in Coeymans land. The store is probably the same one that is shown that Jacob Parish is renting when he's on the property as well. And the store seems to have stayed on the waterfront as part of that property well beyond the sales, and was continued to be used by Jacob Parish for quite a while. Parish by 1813 has also pretty well ingratiated himself into the landing at Coeymans, similar to what he did at the landing at Coxsackie, September 30 of 1813. School District Number 1 in Coeymans, the residents meet to discuss construction of a new schoolhouse. Jacob Parish is elected as one of the district's 3 trustees at that point, the other trustees being Christopher Babcock and Robert Martin. Here's a copy of the actual log from District School 1, where that's noted. It also talks about where to construct the school and gives a pretty good definition of where the property is. 1814, you see Jacob is still a trustee as they're advertising for schoolmaster for District School 1. None need to apply except possessing the qualifications required by the School Act. So, if you're padding your resume, don't show up. District School 1, Dennis, I think you did a great job last time going through a lot of the bird's eye map. Slightly earlier map from 1866, Schoolhouse 1 is actually fairly far up Church Street Hill, just below the Hotel and House, the former Whalen House. That would be torn down. Whitbeck Hall would replace it. Whitbeck Hall would burn. And there's kind of a gap in buildings there. At least one new house went up after that. And that's probably the vicinity that the original School 1 was. 1815, Jacob buys his first parcel of land in Coeymans. He acquires it from Peter and Eliza Ann McCarty, his wife. And as you go through the deed clearly has a reservation, all that certain piece or parcel of land situated, lying, and being in the village of Coeymans Landing, containing 20 acres of land exclusive of a burying ground of 60 square feet where David McCarty was buried, the oak tree being at the center of the said burying ground. So 1815, there's a deed. David McCarty's cemetery is identified as being reserved out. There's an oak tree in the center of that cemetery. It's 60 feet square. But we also already know that one of Jacob's daughters has been buried. And we know that she's on that property because her stone was enumerated, you know. Later on, we know that she was buried there. So apparently there were burials occurring, you know, at this site that weren't all McCarty. So this may have actually been the landing kind of burial ground because there weren't really farm lots for you to bury people in your back lot. So there would have had to be someplace. And I know there were burials at Grove Cemetery area as well, especially for the Blaisdell family. But this is kind of an interesting, you know, discussion of that. It clearly tells us David McCarty's buried here as well, but we know it's the Parish Cemetery. So where did McCarty go? And of course, this just kind of gives you a sense of where those 20 acres were. The house of David McCarty is shown on this 1806 map of the hamlet that actually kind of laid out the house lots by John Randall. General McCarty's house, which is the stone house down on 1st Street, 2nd Street. And you can see the shaded area is just a piece of the land of the 20 acres that Jacob bought. You'll also notice the land goes over 3rd Street, which is now 144 Main Street. That's because in the deed, it was required that McCarty would extend the road. So he was required to extend 3rd Street all the way to the creek, or where the bridge is now. And that was in front of the house and store on the above premises. So it's telling us that when Jacob Parish bought the property, there was already at least one house and an outbuilding, a store on the land facing what is now 144. That would be extended to give him actual road frontage. 1817, Freelove Powell dies at the age of 55, actually. She hadn't turned 56 yet. And she's buried alongside her 2 children, Mary and Elizabeth, at the McCarty, I'll call it the McCarty burying ground at this point because that's how it's been reserved out. They had a son, Benjamin, who died in 1804, but that was before they moved to Coeymans. Benjamin is not enumerated as being anywhere at the McCarty Parish Cemetery. He's more than likely buried at one of the cemeteries in Coxsackie, if not Newburgh. 1821, this was a really interesting entry in Jacob's account because the John Jindell or Sindell, I had a very hard time, that cursive letter just didn't read to me. He bills for $5.16 in full for the balance due on account to work on house as full of all account John Jindell. And I believe this was either the rehabilitation of the house mentioned in the 1815 deed, or possibly the house was torn down and a new house was constructed. And this is the last of the bills being paid to the builder or renovator of that house. 1821, in February, we get this tax bill which shows up because we were still paying taxes back then. And this is the value of the property and then the tax being paid on it. So the first column says that he's paying tax on the stone castle, which is $1.90. And then he's paying tax on the homestead, which would be the parcel he bought from Peter McCarty. He's paying, and that's got an evaluation of $640. He has a personal estate of $2,000, and he's paying $10.03 on that. So he's still paying tax for the castle, which he must still be renting at that point, because you pay tax on rental property as well. And he also has the home lot, and he's got several other properties he's paying tax on. When we go to the following year, February of 2022, he's still paying tax on the stone castle. First time it's being called the Stone Castle, C-A-S-S-E-L. And now his home lot has doubled in value. So what would double the value? $640 is a pretty high assessment, pretty good assessment to begin with. To bring it to $1,200 in 1 year, there had to have been some improvement on the property that would double its value. My belief is that it goes back to that last Jindell bill, which may be that the house was completely renovated or a new house was constructed at that point. In either case, this is the house. So this is the 1889 bird's eye view, long after Jacob is gone. But the house faces Main Street. If Main Street ended here, it kind of talked, that idea that it has to be extended in front of the house and store, all makes sense. This, of course, is going to be later. This is Dr. Friedenberg's house, and these barns may or may not be part of Jacob Parish's construction, but you'll also notice how close it is to the cemetery. What's interesting, too, is the Widow's Walk. This is kind of an interesting architectural, oddity for this area. You see them in Hudson, but you don't really see, there are none in Coeymans. There's towers. Atkinsonville had a tower on his house, but very few widow's walks. Does that have something to do with his life in Oyster Bay, which may have had more seaside architecture, possibly Newburgh, but it's certainly not something that we see much here. The only picture known of the house is this one. You can see the kind of broad widow walk on it. The house with this little round lunette over the entry door going into a back hall entry. The house has been added onto several times. Really clearly federal period, so that 1820s date kind of begins to fit a little bit better. The form fits, the outside fireplace form, and the very simple details, kind of lead you to that 1820s period architecturally as well. The Greek Revival building next to it, kind of bordering Greek Revival Gothic with its tracery around the eaves. Dr. Friedenberg, a little later on, probably about 1850 or 1860, after Jacob was gone from the scene. 1823, Stone Castle again, he's still paying on. And the stone house, storehouse and lot, which is that red store, I believe, that was not part of the, that they talked about in other sales. So Jacob is still working with both of these, and you'll also notice that this tax bill is for Jacob and son. Son would have been James. James was the one son who never left Coeymans, or didn't until after his father had died. 1841, Jacob purchases the cemetery from Peter McCarty, which is kind of an interesting thing. The McCartys obviously had decided that they were no longer going to be using it, decided it needed to be turned over to the owner of the land, whatever. Jacob acquires the property. What's interesting about the acquisition is it also talks about that large oak tree in the center. It talks about, redefines it as, defines it as that 60 feet square. But in the deed, it actually provides a meets and bounds description. And while the deed talks about a 60 square foot parcel, the meets and bounds is 60 feet north, 7 feet west, 60 feet south, 7 feet east. So just wide enough for a strip of graves. So even though it's saying it's a 60 by 60 parcel, the meets and bounds seems to only define just where the parishes are buried, but it talks about the large oak tree. So clearly it's the entire parcel. So the deed clearly has some issues that don't really ever get cleared up. Jacob dies in 1841 at the age of 80. His death cause is disease of the brain. Here's where it's interesting. His estate was calculated in 1860 during a lawsuit to have had a value of $250,000 in 1841 money. 1841, that's about $8.8 million. So where's Jacob getting his cash from? Really good businessman, not a, he's a very modest house. Well, Jacob's wealth was actually inherited almost exclusively from his son Thomas, who died in 1840. Thomas had gone to work with his uncle and his brothers. When he died, he left his entire estate of $200,000 to his father. Jacob established special trust funds of $10,000 for one of James's son, the son who stayed in Coeymans, and $5,000 for his granddaughter that they would receive at their maturity. And again, those are sizable sums of money in 1841. What's interesting about Jacob's burial is his two daughters are buried side by side. There was a space left between the daughters when his wife was buried and Jacob was placed between his daughters and Free Love at the Parish Cemetery. So here's where we're going to drift aside. We're going to look at Jacob's kids a little bit. And this is where we start getting into the 6 degrees of Jacob Parish. Jacob's oldest son, Henry, and his portrait's about, the early portrait, which is pretty remarkable, I think, is about 1820. It's at the Frick Museum, really kind of Dickensian character. And he really was very Scrooge-like. This is a man who lived for business. He did nothing but business. His only extracurricular activity was, he would engage in a game of whist at cars once in a while. But that was his life. And he remained a bachelor until he was into his 40s. Never married, never had time to marry. But he did, he had businesses up and down the eastern seaboard. He had taken his brothers into business with him and trained them the way he was probably trained by Thomas Powell. He retired the first time in 1824 as a fairly young man. And at that point, he had almost $8 million in the bank and single. So living in New York City, $8 million in the bank, I'm going to retire. Didn't last long. Came back into business a few years later, opened up a new shipping concern in New Orleans, and by 1828 he was also named as director of New York's Phoenix Bank, which is a pretty lucrative gig for a guy who was fairly young. Here's where it kind of goes off the rails. So 1828, one of Henry's bank cashiers, John Delafield, and bank cashiers in the 19th century weren't the way we think of a cashier today. They were kind of the bank managers. They were trusted people. They were doing books. They were fairly well educated. Delafield invites his 42-year-old boss to visit the family estate in New York City. There he meets the young Susan Delafield. Boy meets girl. They go out on a date. They go out sailing with the brothers. Within a year, 42-year-old Henry has married 24-year-old Susan. We'll let you ponder how you think that's going to turn out. So let's circle back to the Delafields now. This is where Susan comes from. Susan's mother was Anne Hallett. Her father was John Delafield, a really interesting character who had emigrated from England just after the Revolution. 1783, he comes here, and he comes on a fairly fast vessel that, according to the Delafield family history, was carrying letters of marque from the crown. So letters of marque let the captain of the ship, the English ship, pretty much do piracy against the French. So they encountered a French vessel, according to the Delafield family history. They board it, they seize the assets, and they sail on. For that, supposedly, John Delafield is paid £100, which is a pretty good sum when he gets to America, from the crown. But what's really interesting about Delafield is he was also given a copy of the Treaty of Paris upon leaving England. When he left London, an officer handed him a document to deliver to New York. It was the Treaty of Paris, one of five original signed copies. Now, another vessel's leaving at the same time carrying the official copy to the Congress. Delafield arrives weeks ahead of the other vessel because he was on a much faster ship. Gets there, turns the papers over to be brought to Congress, and it's actually his copy, documented, is the first copy Congress has where they will actually see the actual signatures of the crown on the surrender, on the armistice. So kind of an interesting twist for this guy Delafield and this connection with the Parish family. John goes on to establish a maritime insurance company. He's underwriting goods. Doesn't go well because there's lots of losses. Ends up creating something called the Mutual Insurance Company for fire insurance in New York City. Makes a lot of money, is named director of the Bank of the United States, and then loses a lot of money. By the time of his death, he's nearly broke. But the Delafields are still living a very lavish lifestyle, even though they're pretty much broke. 1842, Henry draws up his will, and at the time, his estate was valued, by his account, undervalued at about $733,000, or about $27 million today. So he's really increased his wealth almost threefold since he first retired. He has an annual income of $60,000, about $2.5 million today. His expenses are about $10,000. So he's investing well. He owns several properties in New York. He made his home in a mansion on Barclay Street. And Barclay Street, I think based on what I could figure out, his house, his mansion was just about where the Woolworth building is now. So very posh neighborhood during the day. And a very nice mansion that he lived in before he married Miss Delafield. When Jacob Parish's sight begins to fail, he's brought down to New York. He spends time at Henry's house. Susan's brother, who's a doctor, Edward Delafield, performs surgery on Jacob. He remains at the house in New York while he's convalescing. And there's also notations that Henry traveled to Coeymans, which they call, a small village on the interior. That's how the Delafields refer to Coeymans, because they didn't quite think that Henry was good enough for Susan. Even though Henry was a multimillionaire and the Delafields were poor, he was just this rabble from the interior, well-heeled like, the Delafields. So, 1844, Henry purchases several lots of land on Union Square. So he's on the north side of Union Square where 17th Street and Broadway come together. It was a pretty nice neighborhood. He paid a lot of money for the land. And really hadn't thought about doing anything with it other than having it as an investment. A few years later, Mrs. Parish decides that she wants to move uptown a little bit. She wants to move to Union Square. So she tries to get Henry to build her a new mansion. He resists. She pushes. He resists. She pushes. He resists. She wins. They start building the mansion. It's reported he wants nothing to do with it. Whenever the architect, and he had hired his own architect to do the work. Mrs. Parish fires him, hires the Delafield architect to do it. They build a 4-story mansion, 3 stories above a raised basement. There was an entire entertaining floor with a Moorish room and an Egyptian room and a music room and a Victorian room. And he hates it. So when the place finally is completed, he refuses to kind of go to it. He chooses not to live there. And after several months, he leaves the Barclay Street house that he loved and moves in. A few months later, he suffers a debilitating stroke. And one thing Henry hated about the house was having to go up multiple flights of stairs to get to a chamber, to get to his room, which was on the top floor. Once he had the stroke, he couldn't climb the steps. So he had to be carried up several flights of stairs. In fact, when he was struck with the stroke at one of the exchanges, people who were near him carried him up 3 flights of stairs to bring him to his bedroom. And he would never climb the stairs himself. He'd be carried for the rest of his life up and down the stairs. And the doctor who would attend Mr. Parish was Edward Delafield. Mrs. Parish would let no one else attend her husband. As part of Mrs. Parish's concern for her husband, she decided it'd be great to build a mausoleum. So in 1851, she starts the process. She hires her brother, who is a brigadier general and also a superintendent at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, to design a mausoleum for her family, her husband, basically, which is really nice. And according to testimony, Mrs. Parish, having determined to build a vault for her husband at Greenwood, takes him to see it. Now, the guy has had a stroke. He's paralyzed on one side. He cannot communicate other than with one arm, and he could say nay, nay, or ya, ya. That was the extent of his language skills at that point after the stroke, but probably still cognizant of what's happening around him. She took him there monthly, if not more than once a month, through 1850, 1851, and 1852. What a sweetheart.
Here's where we're going to be.
Here you go, man.
Now here's where you get the real sense of Susan Delafield. So the only parish in Henry Parish's tomb is Henry Parish. The other 40 people, I mean, this is not like this was, she takes him to see his tomb. It's not his tomb. It's a parking lot 40 of the Delafield family are entombed with poor Henry in this vault, which fills the entire hillside. And the real coup de grace is, you can see where Henry's name is etched in one block on the side retaining wall, but on the obelisks or at the entry, can you read the name?
Delafield.
It's Susan's parents. The other weird thing is, you have a Quaker in an Egyptian revival tomb with a Celtic cross over the entry. Not quite sure about how that happens. And you also need to realize that when you go to Greenwood, this is the Delafield vault. It is not the Parish vault. The other interesting thing about Mrs. Delafield, and part of this comes out in the lawsuit, is her efforts to try to make Henry not seem quite as infirmed as he is. She has her pastor come to the house several times and try to baptize Henry. Now Henry's, in his 60s now. He's a Quaker. He may have attended services with her, but the family's Quaker. So several attempts to baptize him. With his one good arm, he shoos the minister away. And this goes on for several weeks till finally, I think he just capitulated and he got splashed. And then she tried to get him to do communion. And he would keep knocking stuff out of her until finally, again, he just gave in. But all of these to try to make him seem like his stroke really wasn't that bad. He was just living his normal life up on the 3rd floor in his bedroom. After Henry dies, soon after that, it comes to light that while he was infirm, 3 codicils had been added to his will. These were all done well after the stroke. The changes stripped the residual of his estate from his surviving brothers and sisters and replaced them with Mrs. Delafield as the sole inheritor. Now, she was already set to get a sizable inheritance from him. She took it all. And this began a series of lawsuits. Daniel Parish filed the first lawsuit. And what's really interesting, as you go through the court case, Susan Delafield spends 2 years trying to get her hands on Henry's will, which is in a lockbox at Phoenix Bank. And because she's not an executrix on the will, they won't give it to her. And she actually at one point drags poor Henry in and has people hold him up like he's capable of walking so that she can say, oh, don't you want your strong box, don't you, dear? And he's going, nay, nay. So there's this whole awful process going on. Eventually she does get her hands on the will, and the codicils are written. And in 1862, the court case finally resolves. The court case went on for 6 years. There were actually several suits that went back and forth. It's written up in 6 volumes of 1,000 pages each, all the testimony. You can read it if you want. It's a lot of fun on Google Books. And it actually creates the status for capacity to assent or dissent on a will. So it's a court case that was probably referenced for quite a while. The Court of Appeals found that Henry lacked the mental capacity to assent to the codicils, and they were all struck down. The residual of the parish estate then went to his surviving family. She got what was due her from the original will. And what's interesting is that at the end of the very lengthy Court of Appeals opinion, the 2 dissenting justices I found had the best comment. That they could have pursued this course for 6 years towards a man without understanding and still suppose him to be intelligent could never be believed. In other words, they're saying, how could nobody would believe that this happened? But then they go on and say the positions on the other side, being the parishes, attribute to Mrs. Parish not merely the wickedness, but the power of a demon. And as I said, she had passed away before this ended, so her brothers who were next in line, got nothing, except what was in her estate. The other brother, less Dickensian than Henry, is Daniel. Daniel's younger, born in Coxsackie, marries at Newburgh. At 18, moves down with his other brother Thomas to apprentice with Daniel. They end up being, him and Thomas are moved down to Charleston to run the warehouses there and to run the business. He returns in 1825 to New York when Henry retires the first time and takes over the New York businesses. Daniel and his wife would have 9 children. In the court cases, they're referred to in court as a large and expensive family. Unlike Henry, who seemed to be more frugal with his accounts and estate because he lived a lot longer as a bachelor, I think, than Daniel did, Daniel likes to spend money, and apparently really enjoys doing it. So he'd been through several homes, resided in 12 Beekman Street until 1831 when he moved to Barclay Street, living next door to his brother, where they built adjoining mansions. And then he builds in 1855 this mansion on 16th Street at Fifth Avenue in New York. This was actually a etching that was done at the time because it really was considered to be one of the finest houses to have been built during the period. And he ran multiple businesses during his time in New York as well. So very successful in his own right, owned, had tremendous wealth. So much so that in 1852 he commissioned Andrew Jackson Downing and Calvert Vaux. Now, Downing and Vaux, for those of you who aren't aficionados of architecture, are the shining lights of the mid-19th century. So when you think about Gothic Revival homes, anything pointy, okay? We have one on Church Street, Gothic Revival, actually the front of the Acton Seville house that was taken down was very Gothic Revival. But if you've been to Lyndhurst or you've been down to Newburgh or anywhere you go, you see these little Gothic confections, Downing and Vaux. They're the ones who really promoted it. They published pattern books that took advantage of new technology of scroll sawn wood and details, and really taught people how life should be lived both in a building and out of a building, how the landscape should commune with the buildings. Very, very important. Calvert and Vaux were hired to design the new estate at Newburgh. This is one of the first of the grand houses, the grand cottages on the river walk, on the ocean walk. So it really, Daniel's kind of leading the way with one of the first kind of big palatial houses there. And he hires important architects to do it. On the way there to oversee the work, Downing drowns. He dies, burns in a steamship fire. He was aboard the Henry Clay, which was racing from Albany with another ship called the Armenia, and the Henry Clay caught fire. The boiler exploded just off of Yonkers. The pilot tried to steer it into the rocks or the beach. The steamship's 200 feet long, so the fire is midship. So the people who were at the front of the ship were able to get out. The people aft, because people really didn't swim back then, jumped into the water with heavy clothes and petticoats. A lot of women went down. A lot of men tried to save them. They went down, fast currents. 50 people died, including Downing, who I believe was burned. I don't think they ever recovered his body, or they may have. He was buried in bits and pieces. That led to the outlawing of vessel racing. But again, very important, died very young, 37 years old. And I questioned when I first read this, the validity of it, because it seemed weird that Vaux, how would Vaux have died? Parish, it didn't seem possible. Then I was directed to Vaux's book, Cottages, and indeed, Villas and Cottages, Vaux in his preface, Mr. Downing was on his way to Newport to superintend the execution of Mr. Parish's villa on that day when he lost. The loss of Henry Clay, in an instant, struck out his name from the roll of living men. So that's pretty good proof. So now we've connected the parishes to Newport mansions. We've connected them to the death of Downing. We've connected them to some lots of interesting places that the Parish family seems to connect to. Daniel was a child in Coeymans. Henry was a young man in Coeymans. Thomas and James. After the parishes died, when the parishes sold the house, I was purchased by William Backhouse Astor Jr., who renovated it, hired a very well-known architect to kind of aggrandize what was already a grand house, expanding it, creating a dining room that could seat the 400, which is pretty astounding. It was inherited by their son John Jacob Astor, who went down in the Titanic. Today it's owned by Larry Ellison of Oracle, and Ellison is undergoing millions of dollars of renovation to turn it into an art gallery for his a massive art collection, 18th and 19th century, and at some point hopefully it will be back open to the public. Daniel dies His obituary is published in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, 1880. And if you look at the obituary, there's 2 sentences about poor Daniel, and the rest is about Henry's court case. So, overshadowed yet again. But he opted for a smaller plot, and it's just parishes. So, he's also at Brooklyn, at Greenwood Cemetery. But, you know, a case widely known 20 years ago, in consequence of the celebrated contest upon which the will of Henry Parish and brother of the deceased. Henry Parish was the founder, and so nothing about poor James, it's all Henry. So we're going to go a couple more steps down, then we're going to go back to Coeymans. So Daniel's grandson, Henry Parish Jr., his son Henry's son, also filthy rich because they're filthy rich. He marries a socialite, Mary Ann Harris, who came from a very grandson of Mary Harris. He married Susan Livingston Ludlow, a very influential New York family, 1884. And in 1894, Susan's parents decide to give the couple a house. So they build twin townhouses side by side, because who doesn't want to live next to their in-laws? And it's designed in a way to look like a single building, and the second floor, which was the ballroom for the 2 houses, could be completely opened up to make one grand event space. In 1905, at the turn of the century, Mrs. Parish's young cousin, Aunt Eleanor, who was recently orphaned, moved in with Daniel and Susan Parish into their side of into their home. In 1905, Anne's wedding was held there as a gift from her cousin and her cousin's husband. Any idea who we're talking about? Yeah, that's what I did when I read that. Yeah, it was Franklin. So Anne Eleanor is Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Nee Roosevelt, who, you know, spent her last teen years and early 20s with her cousins. The big ballroom was opened up. There was a canopy of 1,000 roses suspended from the ceiling. You know, the social pages carried it across the country. And TR, of course, gave his niece away, but it was St. Patrick's Day. So TR got tied up in St. Patrick's Day traffic. So, you know, TR, who never met a crowd he didn't love, is trying to get uptown for the wedding, and he's, you know, met with fans and parades, and so, but, you know, he kind of finally winds his way through, they kind of part their way for TR, and he glad hands and gets there, and gives her away. The Parishes spent time in the White House, and Franklin and Eleanor visited the townhouse regularly. So, just you know, all goes back to Coeymans, that backward little, you know, inland town. James Parish, back to Jacob's sons. This is the son who stayed in Coeymans. James's life is less glamorous than his brother's. He doesn't go into business, he farms, tries to do business, has a hard time. He stayed in Coeymans for many years, and in 1834 he acquired half of a mill site on the Hanacroy with Nathaniel Bruce, and they established a paper mill. It would become eventually known as the Ravine Mill, which is the old Fink House, the Ravine Mills in there. Bruce and Parish also bought 176 acres of the surrounding mill from Conrad Vandalison in 1833, and the property included the Coeymans Bronk House. So James Parish comes into ownership of the Coeymans Bronk House. His father, you know, he had actually paid rent on the old stone Coeymans house, the Coeymans Castle, that his father lived in, and I'm sure the kids grew up in, spent part of their years there, because that's probably where they lived. The Vandalisons, this deed becomes complicated because the land sells from Conrad Vandalison to Parish and Bruce, but then a few weeks later, there's another deed copied where Benjamin Friedenberg, Dr. Benjamin Friedenberg, serving is assigned to be guardian of the Vandalison infants, and he executes another deed for the same property. So somewhere in 2 weeks between November 11th and November 27th, it sounds like Conrad Vandalison died, ran away. His wife had already passed away a few years earlier, so there were 3 small children left behind. Kind of sad story. So 2 weeks after the deed signed again, as I just mentioned, the Dallison infants, the paper mill is not successful. 1834, really just a year after they've acquired the property, James needs a loan to keep the paper mill operating, or to build it, I'm not sure which. Things don't change very much. Henry ends up loaning James quite a bit of money over the course of several years, and here we go again with tax sale notices. By 1838, the paper mill has failed, the property is sold at auction, and it's bought by his two brothers, Henry and Daniel, and their wives. And James and his 6 children, probably also an expensive family, eventually moved to Poughkeepsie, but it'll be a few years, so I believe what probably happened is the brothers let James stay in the Coeymans Bronx house until he could relocate to Poughkeepsie. At which point, the brothers break the property up into 3 lots, really. The largest lot goes to Levi Fletcher Blaisdell, who acquires it in 1842. A smaller lot goes to Henry Niles, who buys the Stone House property, and there's still a small mill site. The paper mill site is excluded from all that. That gets sold in 1845 to Leonard Kipp from New York City. So it's known as the Kipp Mill for a while before it becomes known as the Ravine Mill. 1846, James still owes Henry about $400,000. And I think in reading through the court case, a lot of that must have been forgiven because I'm sure he realized his brother was never going to be able to pay him back. 1842, year after Jacob's death, Henry and Daniel and Andrew Sherman, and Sherman is actually Martha Parish's husband. They sell the Parish home in 20 acres to James Trago, who's already living in Coeymans. The deed contains a description or a reservation for the cemetery. And it states also the small piece or parcel of ground near the certain oak tree enclosed by a wall and iron fence. Now, we know the oak tree is not enclosed by a wall and iron fence because the other descriptions have it adjacent to. It's part of the burying ground. Also, so much for a certain piece of ground of 60 square feet, having the said oak tree for its center thereof, is now belonging to the said Peter McCarty. So in this deed where they're selling the 20 acres and house to Trago, the brothers probably don't know that their father had already bought the cemetery because they're saying it belongs to Peter McCarty. It doesn't. It belongs to them, actually. Trago lives in the house for a while, and one of the early entries in Fletcher Blaisdell's diary is on January 7th, 1844, Trago barn burnt. On the 8th, attended Irishman's trial that set Trago's barn on fire. That's the next day. So Trago lost his barn. Trago would eventually sell it to the Terrys. And the Terrys, again, the cemetery is reserved. Terry sold the property to Dr. and Mrs. Friedenberg in 1848. The Friedenberg would stay on the property till the early 1880s. Mrs. Friedenberg died. Dr. Friedenberg, now well into his 80s, moves to live with his daughter, who lives kind of in the Schoharie Valley. And he never comes back. Never sees the house again. Contemporaneous, or right around the same time, as all the land sales are happening with the McCarty property, with the Parish property, David McCarty's granddaughter buys a plot. In 1871, she purchases half of lot 204 at Grove Cemetery. And this obelisk sits in the middle of a fairly big open field, plot now. And the name, it's David McCarty and his wife, his son, who's a state senator, his wife, and another son, Isaac. Those are the only names. They're all on the obelisk. There are no stones. So it's just them. Well, we know where David McCarty used to be buried. He was buried at the Parish Cemetery, the McCarty Cemetery. So in 1871, apparently all the McCartys got moved. Now, whether more McCartys were intending to be buried here or not, no more were, or there's no records that they are. Lena McCarty actually married her first cousin, so she was Eleanor McCarty. They lived in Coxsackie, probably buried there. But that's that kind of lets us know the McCartys have left the building at that point. Friedenberg House passes to their daughter, whose name was Catherine Friedenberg Spraker. She never saw the property. She lived in Montgomery. Well, she grew up in the property, but never came back after her father moved in with them. And eventually, she passed the property on in 1905 to her children, 3 daughters and a son. Benjamin acquires the property from his sisters, 1822. He sells the property to Edward Youthy. So Youthy now owns it, and once again, the deed restricts the cemetery from the property. It also refers to it as a single burying ground. At this point, Dave Perry and Arthur Sinzabaugh are living on the parish property. I think Sinzabaugh was probably in the house. Perry was probably renting the barns as part of kind of livery and blacksmithing work he did. Sinzabaugh and Perry were both given in the deed the ability to stay on the property till the end of their lease, which was the following May. And the following May, according to News Herald, May 4th, 1923, Mr. Arthur Sinzabaugh and his family have moved to Albany. They've resided in this village for over 25 years, and their many friends regret to have them move away. Sinzabaugh would be part of a brick, Sinzabaugh and Sutton. So fairly well. And this picture, according to Ed Giddings, is Arthur Sinzabaugh. Once again, the deed restricts out the owner, the cemetery. And the News Herald also notes that, 1823, part of the property was sold to Albany County for road realignment. At that point, they demolished Jacob Parish's house. The Friedenberg Medical Office would go next to realign that dog leg. You now go down if you're going to go north. You're driving over the Parish house. But it gave a nice view of the new Castleton Bridge, so that was good. 1824, Ed Youthy sells all of the property that he hadn't sold to Albany County for the road to Antoinette Mayon. Now, he doesn't sell it to Antoinette and Peter Mayon. It's just sold to Antoinette Mayon, which is really kind of interesting. But they acquired the property, and once again, the cemetery is restricted out. And if you don't know this building, it's the ones that just got renovated as you're going, just before you get to the bridge. They're on the opposite side.
The old fluffy white.
Yeah, well, next to where Fluffy White got torn down.
Yeah.
You can see just the edge of Fluffy right there on the end. 1828, we have the first record in the cemetery. Mr. Graff goes in. He records 2 separate cemeteries. The first is a parish cemetery, which has, quote, an iron fence around it. And then he notes a separate burial ground on the west side, alongside of the parish plot. So again, McCarty, parish. He records the family of the parishes, whose stones he can read, and then he records names of those outside the fence. And notice there are no McCartys outside the fence. The cemetery is recorded again in 1847, 1848 by the Dutch Settlers Society. They record it in their yearbook. They reiterate the same people inside the fence, name a small stone, and they also have the names of the people outside the fence. They're different than what Graff had. They're kind of the same, but misspellings, things like that. The years were off in Graff's accounting. I think maybe he wasn't looking as carefully as he should have. Ravine Historical Society would also record a stone for Anne Marie Seabridge. So we kind of have a full set now of who at least we know from their stones are buried there. There are probably more. But it's very clear that a couple of years after the Dutch Society went in, that Richard Blaisdell, the father, who did the narratives?
Robert?
Robert Blaisdell, before he died in 57, I believe, also recorded the cemetery. And when he goes in, it's one cemetery now. And he notes all the people that you see outside the fence, Christopher and Mary Babcock, all of them, all of their stones now have a notation after them laid on the wall, which would probably indicate that in that 5 or 10 year period, they all got pulled up or snapped off and moved inside the fence. Which leads us to an interesting quandary. None of those names show up in Grove Cemetery. None of those names show up in Finding Grave, outside the Parish Cemetery. So they're probably still outside the fence. Just the stones, kids must have been messing with them, so they just snapped them off and put them inside the fence, I guess, for protection. So what we know is that, McCarty's, we had 5 McCarty's, and we had at least 10 other burials outside the fence. And then we had the parishes inside the fence, of which we know pretty much all of them. So I'm pretty convinced that indeed we have bodies unmarked beyond the fence line. In 1857, the school district buys the land from the Mayons. Once again, they exempt out the cemetery. So today, this is the cemetery. This is actually a cemetery about in the 90s, 93, I think. The Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts went in to do a cleanup at that point. And we took some pictures to kind of show the condition before. But here you can see kind of really fine bluestone, really nice iron fencing, which surprisingly didn't get pulled up during World War II. It's kind of unusual to find iron fence that's in the woods not being, salvaged. At that time, only one stone was visible. That was the stone of Freelove Parish, which clearly is still laminating, but a really beautiful, finely carved sandstone marker. This matches the 2 daughters' markers. And here are the kids digging through poison ivy. And at the same time, they're clearing off the stones they're finding under the surface. We probed to find them. And you can see some trees and brush coming out. And then after it was cleared, certainly more visible. Here it is a couple of years ago. This is in 2017. You can see where it lines up. The last house on Youthy Boulevard. You do have to kind of come in this way because there's a ravine on both sides that you can't really cross through.
That's my house.
Okay, there you go.
Right on my
You gotta go right where it is. And you can't see it right there right now.
Where's the
But
large oak tree?
you can see how narrow the cemetery is. It really was just one rank of graves. And you can see this beautiful bluestone wall that used to, which we know from the deeds that it was Henry and Daniel, when their father died, when they sold the property to Trago, they referenced the fact that the fence, the wall and fence put up by the party of the first part. So we know it was Daniel and Henry that did the work. And you can tell by the quality of it that it was really fine work. They actually probably raised the front end of the cemetery up a little bit to level it. Looking back up, looking to the west, you can see they've actually tipped over the fence, now flopped forward. But you can see the quality, the iron staples holding the bluestone top course together to keep it in line. And this was interesting. I didn't notice this while I was going through the pictures. If you're looking the opposite way, you can see in this stone, there's a blow up there. Someone actually had drilled it to repair the stone. Probably early 20th century, maybe late 19th century, but someone tried to put Elizabeth Parish's stone back together and probably used an iron pin, which then popped and, created the void you see there. So that's the parishes, that's the parish cemetery. It's a really, really interesting site that we need to kind of know more about. We need to probably go back in there, get those stones flipped around, get them clean, see who actually is there. I tend to think it's more than the 15, 16 people that are recorded over that period of time from Greff forward, and we know from family records. So it's worth probably a little more study. And technically, the ownership, because it was a private family burying ground, still owned by the parishes. I'm not sure they still have any money. I'm not sure where they are. I can track them to about the 40s. then they disappear. But it's not owned by the school district. It's not a public cemetery, there's no corporation, so it can't be abandoned because it's family-owned. So it really is kind of a limbo piece of property. But it'd be great to get back and look at it. I hope you, you know, it's kind of nice to see faces from the past in Coeymans. We don't get to see it very often. And, you know, thanks, but, you know, once again, turns to sand. As much money as they spent on that cemetery, it didn't hold up. So thanks for listening. Questions?
I have one question, John. Why would the school district buy that piece of land? Were they intending to build a school there?
It was sick, it was 57, it was for Peter B. The high school, I believe the high school was originally scheduled to be there.
Okay.
And then a piece of land on 9W became available, shall we say. So they used that for the elementary school instead. Great, thank you all.
Thank you.
Please, look around a little bit.